Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. Excited to have you here and even more excited to introduce my guest. He is somebody that I feel like my husband and I could have benefited from when we were new out of training, not only from an educational standpoint, but just a great sounding board for advice, things to look for, pitfalls to potentially avoid. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Michael Johnson. He is Michael Johnson Legal, which is a law firm that primarily represents individual physicians and often first contract physicians as they evaluate and navigate through their contracts. He helps physicians transitioning between employment, buying and selling practices, and disputes concerning physician contracts and all things in between. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and have a discussion about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I am excited. Michael and I met thanks to Instagram. I feel like, there's the pros and cons to social media, but I'm definitely grateful that it allowed us to cross paths. And I think you've got a lot of great advice that I think a lot of the listeners will be able to take and apply to what they're currently going through. So, Michael, give us a little bit of a backstory to you, your family, and how you kind of got into this physician contract business.
Yeah, very good. So kind of starts in New Orleans. That's where I went to law school and where my wife went to medical school and residency. She's outpatient adult psychiatry. And we met really at the very end of medical school for her. We were both swiping right at the right time. We were able to connect. We spent residency together in New Orleans. And around 2018, 2019, she started looking at her first opportunities, first physician employment agreements. And I'll tell you, this wasn't the area that I was practicing in at the time. But looking at these for the first time, they are wild. Like they are much more aggressive than any employment agreements in any other industries. I had some background in construction, engineering, architect, like those types of employment agreements. And these are much, much rougher than those. So I started looking around, like what resources are out there, what educational opportunities are out there for lawyers and or physicians to learn about this. It really wasn't much out there. So, we did what we had, what we could with her contracts, and kind of learn through that process. And then I started helping some of her classmates, some of her upper levels, and it kind of started snowballing from there. In August of 2019, I started a solo practice, Michael Johnson Legal, with the goal of building out a practice that could close this gap, help individual physicians get thoughtful legal advice as they navigate all the different contracts between them and their work. And it's been a really fun process. So fast forward 6 years later, we have represented thousands of physicians navigating basically every specialty across the country. We're 4 lawyers now, kind of sprinkled across the country. It's a really fun practice area because we get to connect with individual physicians, really talk about how these contract terms really affect your life, your ability to control your career, your autonomy, and offer, kind of beyond the words on the page advice on, what's important and what's not and how to navigate these deals. So that's what we do. We got a couple little kids as well. They keep us busy. So a lot going on.
Well, I love this and I find it so interesting because until we met on social media, I didn't even know it was a thing, in all honesty. And I feel like obviously there's a huge need. You were just talking about the thousands that you have helped. So for the listeners, give us an idea of the type of physician that you help. I know you said individuals, but are those individuals that own a private practice? Are they those that are joining a private practice or a larger institution? Who are the people that you typically service?
Yeah, the majority of our clients are folks coming out of training, first contract. And about 80% of those, maybe more, are going into an employment agreement of some kind, either with a large hospital system or being employed by a private practice, maybe going into an academic setting. At this point, very, very few are starting a private practice right out of training. It's certainly
Right.
possible. Like it's not impossible, but the common trend right now is employment. So that is the majority of our clients. And then we'll help a lot of attendings that are transitioning between jobs, trying to often renegotiate compensation, when they're early to mid career. We'll also help folks buying and selling practices. That's a smaller portion of our practice and only in a handful of states, but we'll help folks navigate their employment contracts in all specialties and across the country.
So, what does this look like? So, let's say, because I have a huge majority of residents that are coming in as first time residents from, all over different states. But at what point do they get their contract, look over the contract, and then what does that process look like then coming to you and being like, hey, Michael, this is my first time seeing this contract. What do I do? And how does that process look?
Yeah, very good. Best practice here is to prepare earlier than that. Okay.
Okay.
My starting advice is to start interview process 18 to 9 months out. Okay.
Okay.
Give yourself plenty of time. If you're looking for a job 2, 3, 4 months out, even like the credentialing process, it's going to be hard for you to be able to start on time, and not having income right after you finish training can be really rough. So
Hmm.
start 18 to 9 months out. And then uh, get educated on like what physician contracts mean. Okay, so
Hmm.
we have a course that I created, Mastering Physician Contracts, at physiciancontracts.com. 9 hours of CME eligible education. Often your academic residency fellowship programs don't have this, which is a
Hmm.
real bummer, right?
It is. I
But
think there's a high need.
yeah, we do a lot of residency and fellowship presentations. Happy to, do something for your program if you're listening. But get educated on some of the basics, and then I highly recommend setting an initial consult, like as you're starting interviewing or during the interview process, with someone like us, and make sure you understand at a minimum the basics of compensation. Okay,
Okay.
we do this comp consult service in the firm. 1 hour, we pull the macro level comp data, and we talk about the norms that you should expect based on your specialty, your practice setting, and your geographic region. And then fourth, how volume plays into this. Okay.
Mm.
It's a lot of residents and fellows want to see a starting base salary that is super high. Okay. But the vast majority of physicians are actually paid on volume. It's more of like a commission
Right.
based type job. So, being educated on what are the typical volume based compensation models. For example, in Durham, it's common to be paid 40% to 45% of your net collections. Whereas if you are an adult outpatient psychiatrist like my wife, you need to understand how work RVUs work and how much you're paid per work RVU. That is really the main driver of your comp. So you might see something from in the 50s and maybe a low, maybe academic, maybe more urban space, to maybe even something in the 80s in a more rural, hospital employed type model, compensation per work RVU. So being educated on what actually matters in comp and what doesn't is a really good place to start. Some employers will hit you with like, how much you want to make during the
Hmm.
interview process, and you need to be prepared for that. And if
Yeah.
you're not, then you could kind of undershoot yourself, or maybe make a little bit of misstep. So first step is education before you start interviewing. As you start interviewing, a comp consult in our firm or someone else that does this regularly is a really good place. Okay. Next step, you'll probably get an offer letter before you get a contract. Not always. Okay. But you need to sit down with your lawyer, go through that offer letter, and see if there's something that you need to consider negotiating. Okay. This is more of like high level stuff. What are the basics of the comp plan? What are the key work obligation issues that you need to clarify before moving forward? Okay. That's usually the offer letter type stuff. So, for
Hmm.
example, for us, we have prioritized opportunities that have offered a partial tele option. Okay. some sort of reduced work week. So a 4-day week or a 3-day week with kind of longer days. We got a couple kids. So having that flexibility is really, really nice for us. So there might be a handful of things that you want to negotiate at the offer letter stage. But then after that, we look at the contract. Okay.
Okay.
We write out a detailed report about what the contract says, how to get in and out of them. What does comp mean? We go through that with you in detail on Zoom meetings. Really make sure you understand what you have, and then we guide the negotiations all the way through. Having a lawyer on your side, someone that does this regularly from the interview process until you sign or walk away is really best practice. Okay, you're going to avoid missteps. You're going to avoid maybe negotiating something that doesn't really matter. You're going to avoid more of the tricky parts, the tripwires that can come up in this process. So yeah, that's my best advice.
Yeah. No, I love that. And, for me, I just assumed right out of training, there's this natural hierarchy, and we just got what we got. That I didn't realize you actually could negotiate those things, being down here and just out of training. But I guess I was wrong in thinking that.
Yeah.
Um, what comes to mind for me, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners, and it's a little bit of a loaded question, so forgive me, but fresh out of training, we don't have a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out, gosh, how do I pay for this? How do I pay these legal fees? Because I think there's this preconceived notion that attorneys are super expensive. And if you're fresh out of training, not having much, is there different ways that this process could work as far as how they pay you, payment plans? I mean, whatever. And you don't have to get into the nitty gritty with it, but I have a feeling a lot of them are thinking that, want to hire you or have your services. But I mean, I remember coming fresh out of training. We didn't have anything, and nor did we feel like we could negotiate anything.
Yeah. So a couple important points. If you, and I highly recommend you get a lawyer that does this regularly and helps you all the way through this process. If you're getting a lawyer that's going to do that, you're almost certainly going to spend between $1,000 and $2,000. Okay. If you're looking at multiple contracts or it's kind of an extended process, it could be more than that. Obviously, if you're buying a practice, it's going to be much more than that. But about $1,000 to $2,000 is what you should expect. The vast majority of folks that do this type of work will offer payment plans. So a 12-month payment plan. You also will often have a signing bonus, something that will pay you within the first 30 to 60 days after you sign, pay you something. So often some of that short-term financial pressures can be alleviated that way. It's also good to keep the weight of these contracts in perspective when you're thinking about risk reward and investment. The vast majority of physicians will make more than $1 million in the first 5 years. Okay, dealing with 7-figure deals here, and they on the employer side are very, very well versed. They're very experienced in negotiating these things, and to have someone on your side that's going to cost you $1,000 to $2,000 to avoid catastrophe here is a really, really good investment. And I'll say also, a lot of employers will tell you that the contract is non-negotiable. Okay? You're almost certainly going to hear this. But I have hundreds, if not thousands of files in my law firm that show otherwise, that they'll say it's not negotiable, and then we will negotiate important things and they'll agree to reasonable changes in the contract. Sometimes they don't go as far as you want, but they often start with no and then consider the things that you're asking for. Also, for the vast majority of physicians, if you start early and consider more than one opportunity, interview at more than one place, you'll probably have more than one offer. And understand, at a minimum, understanding the differences between those two. How do they differ on comp? How do they differ on my ability to leave? Things like non-competes. How do they differ on defining my work obligations, call schedule, work location, days of the week, hours of the week? Understanding these key differences can be really, really important to making an informed choice. So If you're thinking, oh, this is all for naught because they won't change anything, that's not really the right approach. The right approach is to make sure you have clarity, you understand the pros and cons of the deal or deals that you're looking at. You're making an informed choice, and then you're negotiating for the things that are most impactful for you. And a lot of them will consider reasonable adjustments, meaningful adjustments. And that really shouldn't be a barrier. We'll see some outliers, like we had one where we got another $250,000 in the first 2 years. That happens on occasion, okay? Like, that is not
Wow.
the norm. But, there are a lot that it's more like, okay, at the end of this process, I now know very clearly how I'm going to be compensated, what I'm required to do in this position. And then if it doesn't work out, how painful is it going to be to leave? Physician contracts are very difficult to get out of. You've got
Mm,
non-competes, you've got rough termination rights. You might have to pay malpractice tail expenses. You have to pay back signing bonuses or lose out on bonus structures during a transition. They can be very, very expensive.
yeah.
So at a minimum, you deserve clarity.
Yeah. No, I agree because for speaking for myself, a lot of the legal terms are hard to understand. So I think it's nice having somebody there on your side, being able to read through the fine print and put it in terms that I personally would understand.
Yeah, a
So
lot of times these are written in like old Middle English, whereas in heretofores, and I think a lot of employers would do better if they just wrote it in plain English, but
I agree.
the lawyers, they just don't. Like, it
Yeah.
just don't.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense to make sure you understand what you have.
Hmm.
And looking at these for the first time, it's really difficult to get there. But lawyers were trained on this. We're trained negotiators. We're experienced in navigating these deals, and we can help clarify.
And well worth that 1,000, 2,000 to have peace of mind, to understand everything that you are going to be signing and negotiating, whether it's like you talked about your income or what it looks like to actually leave the practice, potentially maybe vacation, maternity, paternity leave,
Yeah.
like all of those things, right?
Very good. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of nuances, a lot
Yeah.
of details
Yeah.
that you need to clarify. Also, you might have a contract and you might think, okay, I've read this and I think I understand what's in there, but you might not know what's not in there and should be,
Mm,
you know?
good point.
So it's difficult to make sure you have it all without, appropriate guidance. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. So, what is the scariest physician contract term that a physician should be on the lookout for?
So I'll modify that question with a couple, typical lawyer
Yeah.
thing, right? So one is a term clause that
Okay.
doesn't allow you, the physician, to terminate without cause for about 2, 3 years or more. Okay.
Okay.
I've had some really rough issues in the firm with folks that signed up for a job, realized a year in that this is not for me. Maybe I picked the wrong practice setting. Maybe this practice is a bummer.
Mhm.
Maybe I need to move. Maybe this is my
Sure.
family's unhappy. There's a lot of things that can happen in this first year or two. You're probably going to know something pretty substantial about whether this job is a long term good fit, probably within the first 6 months to a year. Okay.
Yeah.
Some contracts, maybe about 10 to 20% of contracts, will have an initial lockout period where the physician literally does not have the legal right to leave.
Mm,
Okay. A lot of residents and fellows have dealt with something pretty close to that in training, like you can technically change training locations, but very, very difficult. You probably don't want to do that in the next step. So I'd say scariest piece number one is, do you have the legal right to leave whenever you want? Usually it's like a 90 to 180-day advance notice provision, which I'm typically fine with.
mhm.
But making sure you have that right. I literally looked at one this morning that said 5 years,
Oh
no legal
gosh.
right to leave. Like, whew, that can be really, really rough. I've had
Yeah.
to consider litigation around a clause like this, and I'll tell you, it is nasty. And some employers will hold your feet to the fire. This can be a 7-figure damages problem if you catch
Mm,
the wrong thing. So, one is termination. Okay.
okay.
Number two is the non-compete and or the non-solicit clause that means you have to leave town if this job ends for any reason. Okay. Little background on non-competes. There was an effort by the Federal Trade Commission to make them unenforceable for all physicians across the country. Those efforts have failed. Okay. We still have enforceable non-competes, and it really just depends on the state. There's about 8 or 9 states that don't allow physician non-competes, but the vast majority do. Okay. Whatever is in your contract, you have to be prepared for that to be enforced against you in full to the letter. Okay. You might approach this saying, a 2-year restriction for 30 or 40 miles, like that is so wild. There's no way that is enforceable, but it is. Okay. And the vast majority of other employers won't hire you if you have a non-compete that prevents them, prevents you from taking that job. Okay. They probably have the same non-compete in their contract. So they're not super interested in helping physicians violate these things. So making sure you understand that very clearly. This actually goes into the decision on whether to buy a house immediately or rent for a year, when you move to a new place. Because if you have you have to leave town non-compete, and, you look at that bubble and you say, okay, if this job doesn't work out, we have to pack up and move. And doing that with only 6 months or a year of equity in your home, that can be very difficult. Okay. Now, if you have a much more reasonable non-compete and there are other opportunities outside of that bubble, like you're just not going to have to move. For us, my wife's outpatient adult psychiatry, there's plenty of tele options that she could take at any time for a year or two to wait out a non-compete or just do that. So, in some specialties, this isn't as big of a deal, but in some it is. So watch out for the you have to leave town non-compete. That would be my 2 biggest ones.
Yeah. I would never have even thought about that, but good point. So as I said earlier that we met on social media, Instagram, and I know that is like your biggest platform where you post a lot of your information, a lot of your content. And you had mentioned earlier about some educational courses that you offer. Will you tell the listeners a little bit more about those educational things that you offer, whether on your website or if it's a live Instagram? What does that look like?
Yeah, so education is a big one for us. Okay. At its core, our mission as a firm is to change the balance of power in medicine, put it back in the hands of physicians as best we can. So on the educational side, we have an Instagram profile at Physician Contracts. Okay, we're very obvious, but we post pretty much every day some tips, something that physicians need to be aware of. So I'd love a follow there. It's a good thing to just occasionally scroll from
great
time to
information
time.
there.
Thank you. Just being aware of what's going on. Check out our website too, michaeljohnsonlegal.com, and check out our blog section. So, for example, we have a long, detailed blog about hospital-employed compensation models, about net collections-based models and how they differ, how to negotiate academic contracts. We try to, produce a lot of, background information, something to get you caught up, get you, a bit of a reference point on some of these main issues, non-competes, exit strategies. So check that out. We also have an educational course, 9 hours of watching and listening to me and reading about physician contracts at CME eligible. And that's at physiciancontracts.com. That I tried to build that in a way where this is the education that you need to do. Like, spend a weekend, grab your spouse, okay, have them join in as well. But just do it over a weekend before you start interviewing so you kind of know what's going on. You're going to go into these conversations about jobs, about contracts, about comp with more confidence, with some background information. And those are, really the three main ones. Also, if you have a residency or fellowship program that has space in their didactics, we do virtual didactics. We come join for an hour, talk about physician contracts. We often dive into the particular specialty that we're talking about, some of the nuances that might be different for ortho versus psych versus neurology versus, trauma surgeons. There's some nuances based on specialties that are really important. So we can do that as well. But I'd say this, regardless of how much education you get, it's still really, really important to get an experienced lawyer on your side as you're navigating these, because doing it once or twice is just not going to be enough to be completely fluent in this new language of physician contracts. So we highly recommend that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I always end with 2 questions that I ask every guest. So the first one is, what advice would you give your younger self?
Yeah, so relax, chill out, play a little bit more golf from time to time, like play some
That's right.
tennis. Like, it's gonna be okay. I think that as lawyers, we're kind of like physicians. We often dive in completely into the thing that we
Yeah.
do, and maybe ignore some other important aspects of life. So
Mhm.
maybe chill out. I would tell myself, keep swiping around on Bumble because your wife's gonna be there.
I love that. That's great. That's great. All right. And then the second question is, if your life was a reality TV show, what would the title be?
Goodness. Uh, Chaos with kids, I guess. I think that's kind of where we're at in our life now. So,
Yeah.
my wife's 5, is almost 6 years out of training. We've
Hmm.
got a almost 6-year-old and almost 4-year-old in the house. I did the last day of 3K today, so
Oh,
almost
nice.
teared up. But there's just
It
a
goes
lot of
quick.
moving parts, early in your career, and navigating this kind of sea change. A lot of folks, they might have kids during medical school or during residency, but they
Hmm.
often wait kind of towards the end of residency or early career. And that can have a massive impact on your priorities,
Yep.
on your time, on just how you want to live your life. So, I'd highly encourage you to make sure you understand how your contract works for flexibility, for changes, for potential pivot in your priorities. If you told me
Yeah.
10 years ago that I would have my own practice working from home and, be doing this, you'd be like, whoa, that's not exactly what I expected. But,
Right.
there's a lot of changes coming. So
Yeah.
keep that in mind.
I love that. That's my biggest thing is the seasons of life, right? I
Yes.
feel like what we need here or what we think we need here progressively changes, and we've got to kind of adapt and pivot with that. So I love that. And Michael, thank you for being here today. I think you shared a ton of stuff that is going to be super helpful for our listeners. And if they do want to ask questions or reach out to you, can they just send you a DM on Instagram?
Yeah, that's a great way to connect. At Physician Contracts on Instagram. Send a DM. Sometimes I'll take the really good questions and just do a reel about it. Like, I won't put you out there, okay? Like, I won't say any names. Like, relax,
Stays
okay?
anonymous. Don't worry.
It'll say anonymous. It's
Yeah.
okay. But if you have any questions, send them there, and we'll try to get them answered. Also, you're welcome to connect on the website. It's easy to book an initial consult with us on our website, michaeljohnsonlegal.com. And just I encourage you to just be prepared for this next step in your life. You put so much time and energy and sacrifice into getting to this point. Let's make sure this next pivot, this next transition is done right. And we can
Mhm.
help you navigate that.
Yeah. No, thank you again for being here. And for those of you listening, if this was something that you related to, please leave us a review or send questions or pass it on to another physician spouse that you feel would benefit from this information. And until next time, thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye. That's a wrap on this episode of Behind the White Coat. I hope today's conversation left you feeling more understood and supported. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with another physician spouse. Your support helps more of us to connect. Keep in mind, this podcast is for you. So let's keep this conversation going. DM me on Instagram at Amanda Barron, Realtor, with your thoughts, topic ideas, questions, or even guest suggestions. I would really love to hear from you. Thanks for spending part of your day with me. And remember, you are never in this alone. See you next time.